So there we go. So we made a bunch of constraint lines. We can use the RBD constraint properties here. This is a little funny because this has 3 inputs, but just connect the middle input in our case, because we're only dealing with the constraints right now. And that's what this is. This is the constraint input. So just put it in that one. On here, we can change a bunch of stuff. We can change the strength of our connections, the half-life, which refers to the shock, the propagation of the damage. Well, that's really what propagation rate in propagation iterations is. Propagation rate is how much, when a constraint breaks due to trauma, due to an impulse, really, of a collision, how fast it propagates through this network of things. Propagation iterations is how many times it can move the maximum distance in a given iteration of our sim. And half-life, as it says, I believe, that doesn't say. Half-life will basically be how long it will kind of remember that damage. Like if it only takes one hit, it may not have been enough to break it, but a subsequent hit might push it over the top. So this is how fast the damage decays off of it. And the strength, of course, is how strong it is. So this will make all those attributes for us. If I were to look at this, you can see them all. The constraint name is glue, because that's what it says here. That will be used, as you saw in the previous lesson, to hook it up in the sim. Constraint type, well, that is going to be, well, you can just see here. Oh no, I clicked on the wrong thing again. I knew it was going to cause that crash. I even said that at the beginning of the lesson. I should have just closed this tab so I don't click on it. Anyway, all I was going to say was there really is no point. The constraint type is blank for glues. This is used for hard and soft constraints and hinges and things of that nature. We don't need it for glue. So anyway, that's all I was going to say about that. So yeah, so we have all of our constraint properties here as primitive attributes. This strength it's not going to matter because we're actually about to override it with a glue cluster. Now the glue cluster is interesting because this replaces a big complicated thing we did in the previous version of this lesson. It's much easier now. What the cluster is doing is it's saying, let's take these constraints and group them together. And we'll basically have an idea of everything in a group has internal strength, the way they hold each other together, and then there's an external strength, the way they connect to the other chunks. Again, visualized here as color. So in our case, internal strength is -1, which means never break these chunks. But the strength between the chunks is 1, which is a very weak connection, so break them easily. I do want our chunks to be able to break apart, so I'm going to set this to 100. It's like pretty strong. And I'll keep the 1 here. Impact propagations is an odd thing where it's an older way of, or they're doing a global propagation iteration. It's going to be overridden by our own per primitive one here, so you can ignore that. And there you have it. We can then also randomly detach, just for some variety, just randomly say that these little bits here and there are not part of any cluster. What I think is cool too is we can set our own cluster attribute on the points. So if we do a point VOP, I'm not using a wrangler this time, as you'll see. On the point VOP, I can make using my own noise patterns. I might want to do that because if I use this one, well, I got to use this one. I got to use what came with their tool. But in Houdini, I want to be able to maybe make my own. So I could put a Voronoi noise, which is what they're using anyway. So connect to the position of any given point in here into this noise, and then export, which basically means write out this variable, the seed here. Right? It is an integer. We know that because it's blue. And if you hold your mouse over it, you see it says int. So there we go. We wrote our own cluster attribute from this. And while we're here, we could also make a random color from that to see it. So I'm going to reduce the frequency to make bigger pieces. So if I were to put that into my cluster, you can see that it works. We can see the chunks showing up, and if we wanted to prove that to ourselves, well, we know that the internal strength is 100. So if I isolate only the strength, I'll put an @ sign there, strength equals 100 ones, sure enough, we can see they're now little islands. See how they're islands that don't connect each other. And the other value, I believe, was 1. These are the constraints that connect between them. So that's pretty cool. In fact, if I'm in here in the Voronoi noise, you can see that shift. Pretty cool. We're moving the noise pattern around. Now in our case, I don't think I even really need to go do anything crazy, so I'm going to disable that, but you should know how to make your own, especially because you might want to have, again, multiple patterns that you can then add to each other to make even more interesting patterns, where you might want to have one offset from another one. So now we've got different size chunks all over the place, as you can see here. So that's pretty cool. But again, not going to do it. I'm going to keep it simple for now. I'm just going to use the defaults even. Turn on random detach. So we have lots of these relatively small chunks all over the place. It's kind of hard to see though. Actually, I shouldn't have gotten rid of that. If I were to say strength equals 100, delete unselected, we can see all these little islands. These are all the little harder islands that are going to stick together. If I were to go back to our piece version here, let's go up to 1. Now there's more pieces. It's got to reconfigure all the constraints. Still did it pretty fast, but now you can see there's more stuff in each cluster. The cluster is the same size, but there's just more smaller pieces within a same size cluster now. It'll also be convenient for us in the next chapter to know quickly which ones of these are internal clusters and which ones are external. I kind of wish that this labeled them for you, but we do know the internal ones are 100 and the external are 1. So knowing that, we can set this up. I'm just going to make an external attribute that says you are an external constraint if your strength is equal to, some value. That value is this. So I'm going to copy that, put it here. So now, instead of doing this by strength, I should be able to say, are you external? Is that what I call that? Well, let's see. We have some are 1s and some are 0s, so why didn't that work? Oh, external equals 1. So there you go. So now we have a shorthand for whether they're external or internal. Obviously, if I said, 0, it would be the opposite. Awesome. Great. So now let's move on to doing the glass attributes, or the glass constraints.